There is a strange moment that happens when you stop trying to prove yourself. You say less, you explain less, you defend yourself less, and somehow, people start paying more attention. Not because you suddenly became more interesting, not because you found some secret phrase that makes everyone respect you, but because something changed underneath your words. You stopped giving people unlimited access to your thoughts, and that changes the way they experience you. Think about the last time someone misunderstood you. Maybe they accused you of something you didn't do, maybe someone judged your intentions, maybe you were criticized in front of other people, and your first instinct was to explain. You wanted them to understand, so you started talking. You explained what happened, then you explained why it happened, then you explained what you really meant, and somehow the more you explained, the weaker you felt, not necessarily because you were wrong, but because you were trying so hard to control how someone else saw you. And that is where the psychology of saying less becomes interesting, because sometimes your power doesn't come from finding better words. It comes from realizing that you don't need to use words at all. There is a difference between being silent because you have nothing to say, and being silent because you know not everything deserves a response. Most people never learn that difference. They speak when they are nervous. They explain when they feel misunderstood. They argue when they feel disrespected. They keep talking when they feel insecure. And without realizing it, they reveal something much deeper than information. They reveal how badly they need the other person to approve of them, and people can feel that. You can feel it too. Imagine you're talking to someone who keeps trying to convince you that they're confident. They tell you how successful they are. They tell you how many people respect them. They tell you how much they know. They keep mentioning what they've accomplished. At some point, you stop thinking this person is impressive, and you start wondering, why do they need me to know this? Now imagine someone equally capable who doesn't feel the need to announce it. They answer when necessary, they listen. They don't rush to correct every misunderstanding. They don't turn every conversation into a performance. They don't need every room to know what they are capable of. Something about them feels different, quieter, but stronger. That's because confidence doesn't always become louder when it grows. Sometimes, it becomes quieter. And that may be one of the most misunderstood things about human behavior. We often assume powerful people should dominate conversations. They should have the fastest answer, the strongest opinion, the final word, but real psychological strength can look completely different. Sometimes it looks like sitting there, hearing something you disagree with, and deciding you don't need to fight for the last word. Sometimes it looks like receiving criticism and taking a moment before responding. Sometimes it looks like being misunderstood and accepting that not everyone is going to understand you. That last one is especially difficult because human beings have a deep desire to be understood. When someone gets the wrong idea about us, something inside us wants to correct the record immediately. We want to say, "No, that's not what I meant. You don't understand. Let me explain." And sometimes, of course, you should explain. Silence is not automatically wisdom. There are moments when communication matters. There are relationships that deserve clarification. There are situations where staying silent would be dishonest, passive-aggressive, or harmful. The point isn't that speaking less is always better. The deeper lesson is knowing when your words are actually creating understanding. And when they're only trying to control someone's perception of you, that distinction changes everything. Because once you understand it, you stop asking, "How can I make them understand me?" And you start asking, "Does this actually need to be explained?" That is a much more powerful question. Think about arguments. When emotions are high, people rarely communicate to understand each other. They communicate to defend themselves. One person says something, the other responds. Then the first person responds to that response. Suddenly, neither person is listening anymore. They're collecting evidence. They're preparing the next sentence. They're trying to win. And the strange thing is, the person who says the most often feels like they're doing the most. But talking isn't the same as communicating. Sometimes every additional sentence gives the conflict another place to grow. You explain one thing, they misunderstand another. You clarify that, they interpret your clarification. You defend that interpretation, and now you're trapped inside a conversation you never intended to have. This is why emotionally mature people sometimes pause, not because they don't care. Because they care enough not to react blindly. A pause creates space between emotion and behavior, and inside that space, you get a choice. You can respond, you can ask a question, you can leave. Or you can say nothing. That choice is a form of power, because the person who controls their response is harder to control emotionally. Think about how easily people can pull you into reactions. Someone sends a rude message, you immediately type back. Someone makes a sarcastic comment, you feel the need to respond. Someone posts something that feels directed at you. You start wondering whether you should defend yourself. Someone ignores you, you send another message, then another, not because you have something meaningful to say, but because silence makes you uncomfortable. And that's the part worth examining. Why does silence bother us so much? Because silence creates uncertainty, and the human mind dislikes uncertainty. When we don't know what someone thinks, we begin filling in the gaps. When someone doesn't respond, we create explanations. Maybe they're angry, maybe they're losing interest. Maybe they're judging us, maybe we did something wrong, maybe they're trying to punish us. The mind hates an empty space, so it fills it. And this is one reason saying less can create a strange psychological effect. When you don't immediately reveal everything you're thinking, other people have to interpret. They have to observe. They have to pay attention. They have to experience you instead of receiving a constant explanation of you. But this doesn't mean you should intentionally become mysterious. You don't need to play games, you don't need to ignore messages to make people chase you, you don't need to pretend not to care. Those are performances, and performances eventually become exhausting. Real restraint is different. It's not about manipulating uncertainty, it's about becoming comfortable with not controlling everything. That's a much deeper form of confidence. Because insecurity often sounds like this, I need you to understand me, confidence sounds more like, I'll explain myself when it matters. There is an enormous difference between those two mindsets. One is asking for permission to be accepted. The other is accepting that not everyone will interpret you correctly, and that realization can change how you communicate everywhere. At work, for example, there are people who constantly announce what they're doing. They explain every decision. They remind everyone how much effort they put in. They make sure their contribution is visible, and sometimes that's necessary. You should absolutely communicate your work and advocate for yourself, but there is another kind of professional presence. Someone who quietly does excellent work, speaks clearly when it matters, takes responsibility, and doesn't turn every accomplishment into a performance. People begin to associate their presence with reliability, not noise. That kind of reputation takes time, but it is powerful because people don't only remember what you say. They remember how you make them feel. They remember whether they could trust your judgment. They remember whether you stayed calm when things became difficult. They remember whether you needed constant validation. And this is where saying less becomes more than a communication technique. It becomes a reflection of identity when you know who you are. You don't need to introduce yourself through every sentence. You don't need to prove intelligence by answering everything. You don't need to prove strength by reacting to everything. You don't need to prove confidence by dominating every conversation. You become more selective, and selectivity creates weight. Think about a person who has an opinion about everything, every topic. Every argument, every person, every decision, every piece of news. Eventually, their opinions lose some of their impact, not necessarily because they're wrong, but because there is no sense of selectivity. Now imagine someone who usually listens, they don't interrupt, they don't jump into every conversation, but when they finally speak, people listen. Why? Because their silence created contrast, their words feel deliberate. This is something people understand intuitively. A message repeated constantly loses its emotional impact. A person who is always talking becomes background noise, but someone who speaks with intention can make even a simple sentence feel significant. This doesn't mean you should force yourself to become quiet. Some people are naturally expressive. Some people think out loud. Some people love conversation. There is nothing wrong with that. The goal isn't to become less of yourself. It's to become less dependent on talking as a way to regulate how other people perceive you. That distinction matters. Because sometimes we talk not to communicate, but to relieve anxiety. We talk because silence feels uncomfortable. We talk because we are afraid someone is disappointed. We talk because we want reassurance. We talk because we think if we give enough context, we can prevent rejection. But here's the uncomfortable truth. You cannot explain yourself into universal acceptance. There will always be someone who misunderstands you, someone who judges you unfairly, someone who doesn't like your decision, someone who creates a story about you that isn't true, and no amount of explanation guarantees that they'll change their mind. At some point, you have to let people have their interpretation. That doesn't mean their interpretation is true. It means you no longer believe you are responsible for controlling every mind around you. That's freedom. And freedom often makes people quieter. Because once you stop trying to manage everyone's perception, you suddenly have much less to say. Consider friendships. Have you ever noticed how some friendships become exhausting because every small misunderstanding turns into a huge conversation? One person says something slightly wrong. The other person gets offended, then both people start explaining. I didn't mean it like that, but you said this. Yeah, but what I meant was, that's not how it sounded. And before long, a 5-second moment has become a 2-hour emotional negotiation. Sometimes that conversation is necessary, but sometimes, the healthiest response is simply to recognize that humans are imperfect. People will say awkward things. People will misunderstand each other. People will have bad days. Not every uncomfortable moment is a crisis. Emotional maturity includes knowing which moments deserve attention and which moments can simply pass. That is another form of saying less, not because you don't have feelings, but because you don't turn every feeling into an emergency. And this becomes especially powerful when someone is trying to provoke you. Some people don't want an honest conversation. They want a reaction. They say something provocative. They exaggerate. They insult you, they make a subtle jab, and then they watch. They're waiting for emotional evidence. The moment you lose control, they've learned something, they know what triggers you. They know how easily they can pull you into an argument, but when you remain calm, something changes. The interaction loses its fuel. You don't have to defeat the person. You don't have to deliver the perfect comeback. You don't have to prove you're smarter. Sometimes the most powerful response is simply refusing to participate in the version of the conversation they are trying to create. And that doesn't mean being cold. It means being intentional. There is a difference between emotional control and emotional suppression. Suppression says, I shouldn't feel this. Control says, I feel this, but I don't have to obey it. That's a profound difference. You can be angry without becoming aggressive. You can be hurt without becoming cruel. You can be disappointed without sending a paragraph you will regret later. You can care deeply and still choose silence. In fact, sometimes saying less protects the very thing you care about. Because words spoken during emotional intensity can create consequences that calmness cannot easily undo. A message takes seconds to send, but its meaning can remain for years. And once words leave your mouth, you cannot fully control where they go. That's why restraint is not weakness, it is delayed reaction. It is the ability to let emotion pass through you before deciding what deserves to become language. And there's something else happening psychologically. When you say less, you create more room to listen, and listening gives you information. People reveal themselves when you stop filling every silence. They explain their motivations. They reveal contradictions. They tell you what matters to them. They show you what makes them defensive. They reveal what they fear. They reveal what they want. But if you're constantly preparing your next sentence, you miss all of that. You don't really hear people. You're waiting for your turn. And sometimes the most intelligent person in the room isn't the person saying the smartest thing. It's the person noticing what everyone else is revealing. That kind of awareness requires quiet. Think about a difficult conversation. Instead of immediately defending yourself, imagine asking, what makes you see it that way? That's a small sentence. But psychologically, it changes the entire interaction. Now you're not fighting their conclusion, you're exploring the reason behind it. And sometimes you discover something you never would have found through argument. Maybe they misunderstood you. Maybe they have a completely different experience. Maybe they're projecting something. Maybe you actually made a mistake. Maybe neither of you is entirely right. Silence creates room for those possibilities, and humility needs room, so does intelligence. Because if you already have an answer for everything, you have very little space left to learn. This is why some of the most powerful conversations are not filled with statements. They're filled with thoughtful questions. A person who asks the right question can guide an entire conversation without dominating it. They don't need to prove they're intelligent. Their curiosity demonstrates it, and this principle applies beyond conversation. It applies to social media. We're living in a time where people feel pressure to comment on everything. Everyone has an opinion, everyone has a reaction, everyone has something to say. And because information moves so quickly, silence can feel like irrelevance. But you don't have to react to everything that reaches your screen. You don't have to explain your personal life publicly. You don't have to defend every choice. You don't have to respond to every criticism. You don't have to turn every private experience into content. There is strength in having parts of your life that exist without an audience. Not everything meaningful needs to be announced. Some achievements become more satisfying when nobody is watching. Some relationships become stronger when they're not constantly displayed. Some goals become more powerful when they're quietly protected from outside opinions. Because when you tell everyone what you're going to do, you invite everyone into the process. Their doubts become part of your thinking, their expectations become part of your pressure, their opinions become another voice in your head. Sometimes, saying less isn't about secrecy. It's about protecting concentration. You don't need everyone to know what you're building while you're still building it. Let the results speak when the time comes, and even then. You don't need to explain every detail. There's a quiet dignity in allowing your actions to carry part of the message. Of course, there is a danger here. Because once people hear that silence can be powerful, they may misunderstand the lesson. They may think being silent means ignoring people, or giving the cold shoulder, or withholding communication to punish someone, or pretending not to care. That's not strength, that's avoidance. Healthy silence is not designed to control another person. It is designed to control yourself. That's the difference. If you're silent because you want someone to suffer, you're still emotionally controlled by them. If you're silent because you're afraid of confrontation, that's not necessarily confidence. If you're silent because you don't know how to communicate, that may create distance rather than respect. The power of saying less comes from choice. You speak when speaking creates something valuable. You stay quiet when speaking would only create noise. You explain when explanation creates understanding. You stop explaining when explanation becomes begging. You confront when confrontation is necessary. You walk away when the conversation has become destructive. That is not a rule, it's judgment, and judgment develops through self-awareness. So perhaps the real goal isn't simply to speak less. It's to need less from your speech, need less validation, need less approval, need less reassurance, need less control over how you're perceived, need less certainty that everyone understands you. When that need decreases, your communication changes naturally. You don't rush, you don't overexplain, you don't fill every silence, you don't answer every accusation. You don't turn every disagreement into a referendum on your worth. You become comfortable saying, I don't know, I need time to think, I see it differently, you're entitled to your opinion, I don't want to discuss that, I made my decision, or sometimes, nothing at all. And those sentences can feel powerful because they don't contain desperation. They don't demand that the other person agree, they simply communicate where you stand. That is what boundaries often sound like. Not dramatic speeches, not anger, not threats, just clarity. And clarity is powerful because it removes unnecessary negotiation. Imagine someone repeatedly crossing a boundary. You explain it once. They do it again. You explain it again. They do it again. Eventually, you realize something uncomfortable. Your 10th explanation isn't stronger than your first. At some point, behavior becomes the communication. You don't need to keep giving speeches about what you will tolerate. You can simply act accordingly, and that's one of the deepest forms of saying less. Your life starts communicating for you, your consistency communicates, your standards communicate. Your absence from unhealthy situations communicates, your calmness communicates, your work communicates, your choices communicate. People begin to understand you not because you've explained yourself perfectly, but because your behavior is consistent enough that it doesn't need much explanation. And consistency is difficult to fake. Anyone can give a powerful speech. Anyone can promise change. Anyone can say the right thing, but over time, behavior becomes louder than language. This is why saying less can make you more powerful, not because silence magically creates status, not because fewer words automatically make you wise, but because when you stop using words to constantly prove who you are, your actions get more room to speak. And perhaps the most powerful shift happens internally. You stop experiencing every misunderstanding as a threat. You stop feeling like every criticism needs an immediate defense. You stop believing that every disagreement means someone must be convinced. You begin to understand that being misunderstood is sometimes part of being human. You can be a good person, and someone can still dislike you. You can make the right decision, and someone can still disagree. You can speak honestly, and someone can still interpret you incorrectly. You can walk away from something unhealthy, and someone can still call you selfish. You cannot control all of that, and trying to control it will exhaust you. At some point, peace becomes more valuable than being perfectly understood. That's when silence stops feeling like emptiness. It starts feeling like space. Space to think, space to observe, space to choose, space to let people reveal themselves. Space to hear your own thoughts without constantly filtering them through someone else's approval. And maybe that's what you've been missing. Maybe you don't need a better explanation. Maybe you need fewer explanations. Maybe you don't need to convince everyone that you are confident. Maybe you need to become comfortable enough with yourself that confidence no longer needs an announcement. Maybe you don't need the perfect response to every insult. Maybe you need to decide which insults are beneath your attention. Maybe you don't need to win every argument. Maybe you need to recognize which arguments are costing you more than they're worth. Because there is a strange kind of power in realizing, I don't have to respond. Not because you are afraid, not because you are powerless, but because your attention is valuable. Your words are valuable, your emotional energy is valuable, and you are allowed to be selective about where you spend them. The world will constantly invite you to react. Someone will misunderstand you, someone will challenge you, someone will provoke you, someone will doubt you, someone will try to pull you into an argument that doesn't deserve your peace. You will never run out of opportunities to speak, but that doesn't mean every opportunity deserves your voice. Sometimes, the strongest thing you can say is a calm sentence. Sometimes it's a thoughtful question. Sometimes it's a clear boundary. Sometimes it's an honest explanation. And sometimes it's nothing. You simply breathe, you let the moment pass, you watch. You decide and you move forward, because power isn't always about having the ability to speak. Sometimes it's about having the ability not to. The next time you feel that urge to explain yourself, pause for a second, ask yourself, am I speaking because this truly needs to be said? Or, am I speaking because I need them to see me differently? That question alone can change the way you communicate, and the more often you ask it, the quieter your insecurity may become. You begin to discover that you don't have to chase respect. You don't have to demand attention. You don't have to force understanding. You can simply become someone whose words have meaning because you don't waste them. And if this way of looking at human behavior made you think a little differently, you'll probably feel at home in the deeper conversations we explore here at NEXMIND Core. But before you go, remember this: the goal was never to become silent. The goal was to become intentional, because anyone can talk when they're emotional. Anyone can explain when they're afraid of being misunderstood. Anyone can react when they're provoked, but it takes a different kind of strength to pause, to listen, to think. And then decide whether your words are actually worth the space they are about to occupy. Sometimes they are, and when they are, say them clearly, say them honestly, say them without fear. But when they aren't, let the silence remain, because the moment you stop feeling the need to prove yourself with every sentence, your presence begins to speak for you, and sometimes that says more than words ever could.